Don't tell me that the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. Hello and welcome to Shining Moon, a Speculative Fiction Podcast, episode 38. I'm your host, Deborah L. Davitt. Today we'll continue our series by asking questions about writing games, particularly role-playing games. This is a subject very dear to my heart because I've spent 20 years of my life playing RPGs, mostly in written form and play-by-post games. Matter of fact, that's how I met my husband. So I am a big proponent of how they help develop writers' skills at world building, characterization, and plot. My guests today are Marsh Davies and Jim Rossignol of the game Teeth. Marsh Davies is a writer and illustrator who has worked in games for the better part of 20 years, first as a journalist, then as an artist and indie developer. He joined Mojang, the creators of Minecraft. Oh, I have you to blame for my son's obsession, do I? As head of creative writing before returning to the indie scene as a narrative designer and co-authoring a collection of grotesque tabletop role-playing games with Jim. Welcome to the podcast, Marsh. Pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you as well. Thank you for having us on.
Oh, absolutely my pleasure, because I am a big fan of Teeth. Not just the ones in my mouth, I mean the ones in your role-playing game. Jim Rossignol is a writer and game designer. In the first part of his career, he was best known for games-related journalism, in which he founded the PC gaming site Rock, Paper, Shotgun. Later, he moved into game development, producing digital games such as Sir, You Are Being Hunted, and more recently moving into tabletop games with the RPG Teeth. Welcome to the podcast, Jim.
Thank you for having us on. Our pleasure.
It is absolutely a delight because I have gotten so much pleasure out of GMing the initial modules for Teeth for my gaming group, and getting to speak with the people who were demented enough to create this is absolutely a delight. So let's first talk about your backgrounds in writing. All three of us come at this writing thing from a variety of different angles, and we have worked our way across the verdant jungles of paying writing to get where we are today. Let's talk about that a little bit. Where did you get started, Jim, and Marsh, and how did you wind up in RPGs?
Well, Marsh and my background is actually a little intertwined, as that we both got our break at Future Publishing, magazine and website publishing group in Bath in the UK. I think I started a few years ahead of you, Marsh.
Oh, yeah. You were an old hand by the time I rocked up. A sage wizard dispensing advice.
But yeah, I think I probably left magazines by the time I met Marsh, but he was working on magazines there, and I continued to freelance and write around that era, and I lived in Bath. We both lived in Bath for a number of years at the same time. Came to know each other socially, came to know each other through work, and then I think our well, certainly my career went much more focused on one thing, which was the Rock Paper Shotgun, which was the website we founded. I'd spent a few years doing general freelance, so just making ends meet, writing for magazines and websites of all kinds, newspapers. I did a book called This Gaming Life for University of Michigan's digital culture books, which was an imprint they ran for a few years. And that was a sort of it was a sort of collection of the journalism that I'd done, plus some new bits and rewritten parts, sort of talking about gaming around the world, gaming in different cities, my experience talking to people. So the culture in South Korea was very interesting at that time. And I talked to people across the US and in Iceland and in the UK, and just in these different situations and how people approach digital games, playing online, identifying as gamers, meeting people that they subsequently married through games and things like that. So I did a lot of that, and then moved on to Rock Paper Shotgun, was where we knew we had to found something and own it to really get some traction. Rock Paper Shotgun is still going, but I ended up selling that in 2017 because there's 4 writers. We were just not equipped to handle something getting big and requiring more investment and management and all the rest of it. But at the same time, sort of overlapping the end of that work there, I had started doing some game development, for which I have no technical ability whatsoever. Not a programmer, not an artist, but what I'd learned on Rock Paper Shotgun and what I was able to bring as a writer meant that all the projects that we produced had a sort of level of authoredness to them, I think, which I helped contribute towards. And I found that one of the things that I was really striking in my writing career, and I think that came both from being a critic as well as being a creative, was that in digital games, I wasn't that into writing and dialogue. Like, I love the world building. I love the framework that I created for us to create the game within, but I didn't tend to foreground that writing. That was never the main event. The experience of running around in the world and interacting with characters, interacting with that, all that stuff. It sort of comes from written documents. It comes from writing. It comes from the context of building those worlds and writing the materials that end up then being transformed into game materials. But it wasn't like the writing was at the front of that. It wasn't the most visible thing. It was certainly there. If you dug into any of those games, my writing would be in there, but it wasn't showcased. It wasn't at the front end. We tried to avoid things like cutscenes or montages. Those elements certainly were in there, and I think that was the difference between writing in the sense that the sort of book writing and journalism that I've done, and what the games industry now calls narrative design, which is writing as a process folded into all the other media and processes. So that's what I was sort of learning there.
It's a very architectural and spatial way of storytelling, right? So it's the story is non-linear and it's dispersed through the environment, so a player can go anywhere and infer things and piece them together themselves. And I think that's a thing that really influences the way that we approach TTRPGs, right, Jim? Because it's we do have an amount of authored story, but a lot of the time we are attempting to seed story into an environment that the players have some freedom to explore.
Yes.
I think that's the overlap, really.
I think one of the sort of principles that Marsh and I have always talked about, and I think this comes a lot from the kind of games, digital games that we're interested in, and certainly the ones that I worked on, and Marsh contributed to as well. So there's a bunch of Marsh's art in So You're Being Hunted, in fact.
Stuffed badger.
Yes, a
nice
stuffed
block
badger.
of Stilton cheese.
a bag of chips. But I think one of the things that we've always shared in terms of that being important to us is, on the one hand, games that create a fantastic context, a fantastic kind of, this is the circumstance in which you play. And also that if players, readers, dig for more, then they should find it, that the lore should be there. However buried, if you dig, then the buried treasure is there. And I think that I feel like that's part of my overall trajectory. I think would be to that one kind of principle, from writing critically about games and then to creating games. I think that's the thing that I really love, is that writing produces fantastic context, but it also provides that sort of treasure to dig for and to
I particularly enjoy going through Teeth because there's always more to it. There's always a footnote that leads to another page and it's layered like an onion. So I do appreciate that. Marsh, how about you in terms of your writing career? How did you wind up moving from indie games to writing indie games? How did you go from the Mojang and Minecraft to this?
Well, it's always been there, sort of bubbling in the background. I mean, I started out in academia, like yourself, studying medieval literature, and then didn't know what to do with myself. Applied for a job in a magazine and got it, and that's how I ended up in journalism. It was just happenstance, really. But I do think all of these different kinds of disciplines that I've been learning throughout the process of my career, like as an academic, and then as a journalist and an editor, and then even and writing for video games as well, where you're doing so many different kinds of tasks. Like I mean, as Jim says, like the games that Big Robot have produced have concentrated on this sort of dispersed environmental storytelling, but there's also direct narrative. So you often, there's lore to be read, there's dialogue to be performed, there's interactive dialogue, there's branching stories, technical documentation. All of these different things are encompassed by writing for games, and it's interesting how you end up bringing a lot of these things to bear on tabletop role-playing games as well. Like there's I mean, my experience of the kinds of games that I've worked on at Mojang, so I worked partly on story mode, which is a game with branching narratives. I didn't actually do the writing on it. I was like the project manager for it on Mojang's side, but just being exposed to the kinds of challenges that occur when you're trying to write branching narratives. A lot of that is about anticipating the variety of things that a player might want to do. And that's exactly what GMing is, right? You're thinking ahead of the player and trying to actually have an amassed amount of content at your disposal, or at least enough content at your disposal that you can improvise. And
lots of improvisation.
Yeah, I mean, Jim is much better at this than I am. He is a natural games master, a dungeon master, in that he is able to. You can't even tell when Jim is improvising. That's how annoyingly good at it he is. Whereas I need all of the possibility space to be kind of nebbishly mapped out in front of me before I can do anything. I stumble if I'm forced to improvise. So part of what ended up being in Teeth is just that instinct to overproduce a huge amount of that possibility space, to completely map it, to have content in any possible direction that somebody might choose to go. And a lot of that comes from like it comes from the sort of the game developer's dictum of having layers of fiction within every environment. There's a thing, I think Valve coined this, where every environment they created need to have 3 levels of story in it. I might be bowdlerizing this. Jim might know better, but I think there's, so like, say you end up in an abandoned power plant, then you have a layer of story which is the history of that place. So it was a power plant, and then maybe there's another story in there which is its more recent history. So perhaps like a family took shelter there and came to a sticky end. And then there's the story of the present, which is your story, which is that it's become a nesting site for some horrendous creature and you need to engage with that. And so you need to say what the place was, what happened there since then, and what it is now. And I think that's a really useful way of thinking about any described environment in any sort of fiction. I have no idea if I actually answered your question at the end of that, but
it was an interesting answer.
That's all
I
we can
enjoyed
hope
listening
for.
to it. I come at writing from such a different angle to some of you, to both of you, because I did start off in academia like you did, Marsh. And then I rather desperately needed a job with health insurance. So I wound up in technical writing. And that's where I learned the premier lesson that permeates even my poetry to this day, which is clarity, 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 and yet more clarity. A lot of people who write poetry like to put in ambiguity on purpose. They like to be very clever about trying to hide meaning and make the audience work for it. I'm like, no, I really want my audience to understand what I'm going after. So that even permeates my games writing, which is I want my audience to get the clues. I want them to, even when I'm layering things in where there's a deep past, and I want those clues to be very evident to the person who's reading my book to say, okay, were they originally humans? Where did the humans go? What happened to them? Are all these little cute furry animals that we're running around with actually humans that have lost all their memories of being human and have had their forms distorted horribly? What is this? But I have to have that layered in, and I have to have that available to the audience. Otherwise, I feel like I've completely failed at my purpose. So yeah.
Right, well, yeah, I think an underrated aspect of technical writing is how empathetic you need to be. Because the whole point of it is that you're thinking, what will the reader need at this point? What's their understanding of what's going on? What do I now need to reference here to connect things up for them and to make things apparent? And all of those questions are essential things when you're thinking about user interfaces or user experience flows, and they're completely the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about when you're describing a world to be played as well.
And you asked me a question about how much of a pedant I am about medieval and Renaissance history, and the answer is incredibly so. We can talk about that a little bit later, maybe after the broadcast. But yes, if something isn't working right for me, if I find that someone has written about a carousel in the 18th century and they go to it at night when there's nobody else around, and they suddenly get on and the horses move up and down, I go, where does the electricity come from? That is not how carousels actually. It takes me 5 minutes to look it up on Wikipedia to know that a carousel in the 18th century, the horses hung from little ropes and they were spun around and people went wee. It doesn't take me that long to find that out. You spent a lot of time writing about this carousel, and it's a very important set piece. You should have done your research. So,
yeah, I get very wound up about this kind of thing. I think. Maybe Jim finds this quite irritating about me.
It's useful. It's good. It's always good material.
But I just find it very hard to stop when it comes to this sort of stuff. Where do you? There's writing a world. Everything is connected, and there's chains of etymology going back thousands of years in the real world. So if a source book has a village in it called Hogford and there isn't a ford there or even a hog, then I'm genuinely angry. But I don't know when to stop. At a certain point you do just need to say, this isn't serving anybody apart from my own obsessions. But I don't know when that point is. I haven't hit it yet.
Well, my husband likes to point out that I wound up writing several thousand pages of alternate history, and how does this relate to my need for history to be correct? I'm like, well, that's my history, and everything is linked one to another, like the world's best game of Civ. And if something wound up being worked on earlier in this world's history because Rome never fell, then that also connects to other things that they had early connections to China, and therefore they had the information about smallpox, and that where they had the derivation of a vaccine much earlier, and therefore we didn't have the desolation of the Americas due to smallpox, and so on and so forth. And so, it's my history, and it all works. God damn it!
But does that? I mean, maybe Jim, do you think that matters to you as a GM? I mean, it's important to us as producing a source book that this stuff needs to be at least passingly correct.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it depends on the extent to which it supports the hooks of the situation right there and then. I think I was watching Quinn's Quest videos, and he was talking about how Lancer had an enormous backstory that went going back thousands of years, and he was sort of saying none of that impacted on the situation right there where the robots were fighting each other. And so, to read it was, and I was sort of torn, because on the one hand, the GM in me was like, yeah, I don't need that. What I need to know is the situation right there. But the other was, I really want to read what the what the enormous kind of history that they set this up. Like whenever I get a Warhammer source book that explains 10,000 years of what Space Marines have been doing before what they're doing right now, I just sit and read the whole lot because I can't help kind of needing to see, do they build it up correctly? How does that work? Does that interlink? What are the mysterious things that they've left hanging that I can go, oh, that's interesting. All that kind of stuff. I can't get enough of it. And I am a Wikipedia, well, not just a Wikipedia, but like is it what's the is it fandom? I can't remember, but
fandom.
Those the wikis that are just deep lore, especially of Warhammer and Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
I just sit and read them for hours for no purpose other than to see all the dots connect. And none of that will ever impact my game of Warhammer, or if I was to run a Lord of the Rings game, I doubt knowing who killed Gothmog would help me in any way in the situation that we're likely to actually play the game with some hobbits in a wood. But I still find that stuff really. I just can't not read it. Maybe that's as much me just as a reader generally than it being anything to do with gaming. I love world building. I love reading just normal history books and biography books because it allows you to see how stuff links together. And I've been reading a bunch of stuff that's sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, and seeing all these sort of historical bits and pieces falling together that makes me go, oh, right, so that's why this is like this is. And in the same way, your understanding of our actual world comes together through being able to see how one domino of history connects with the next.
Yes.
The same is true of speculative and fictional worlds where, you get to see all that interlocking. And I think it is completely unnecessary, but it's just so good. It's so rewarding to know that that's there and to be able to just indulge and, sit and read it.
Well, I will say that the more depth that a source book gives me, the happier I am as a GM, because then I can throw random things that might have been a footnote on page 337, but I can grab that and it becomes a whole hook for an adventure. And my players go, where did this come from? Page 337. Oh, damn it. We didn't even know that was there. And yet you've now fleshed out an entire adventure based on this throwaway line. And it's everything is a source of ideas. So I appreciate a well-designed source book. I really do. So let's talk a little bit about your system, which is Teeth, which is a setting and a system. It is based on the system of Blades in the Dark by John Harper, but diverges in terms of both rules and setting dramatically, being set in a slightly horrific, slightly humorous 18th century instead of a post-apocalyptic Victorian steampunk fantasy realm, which is what Blades in the Dark is about. Let's first talk about the setting. What were the books, movies, games, or comics that were the biggest sources of inspiration for Teeth?
Oh, this could be a long list here, but I think like
touchstones are great.
There's a bunch of different parts to it because we sort of stumbled into the 18th century and after a quite erratic development process, and we arrived at the setting and the time period and the tone somewhat asynchronously. So they're like, there are definitely games and books and so forth that were always going to inspire us because they're like a huge part of who we are and all the baggage that we bring specifically to TTRPGs. But then I think the closer we got to a specific time period, the more we were consciously drawing on relevant stuff. But I think maybe to start with the kind of the broader scheme of things, I think like we immediately knew that we wanted to do something in a cursed landscape, like where the landscape itself was a main character and an antagonist, and just moving across it felt significant and evocative. And that desire came out of, well, obviously our own love of landscape and hiking and being in nature and so forth, but also how effectively games like Symbaroum had keyed into that. And Symbaroum is this another tabletop game, for those who don't know, which is set in this absolutely horrible continent-spanning forest, and it has, it should win awards for like the most disquieting elves in a game. It's a really sinister, unpleasant, biologically just disturbing fiction. And we played like a bit of that with our tabletop crew, and we really enjoyed how it made being in a horrible forest just this perpetual and oppressive challenge. Like it's a real presence in the game.
Okay.
And we didn't like the rules in some other regards, and but that was actually the genesis of Jim and I's collaboration, which eventually turned into Teeth, which was that we attempted this very quickly derailed attempt to convert Symbaroum to the Forged in the Dark rule set. But then as the more we got into it, the more it diverged from that, and I think in other ways, like the way we were thinking about landscape and how challenging and characterful it can be, we are inevitably going to draw on Stalker, which is Jim's great love, which is a video game series loosely based on the Russian sci-fi novel Roadside Picnic and its various adaptations. And then connected to that, as our lives just sort of completely unraveled during the pandemic, Jim and I spent several hundred hours, maybe even 1,000 hours in a multiplayer game called Hunt Showdown, which is a game in which horrible cowboys kill monsters in a cursed Louisiana swamp. I think, is it Louisiana? It's somewhere.
I believe it's Louisiana. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
definitely not a real Louisiana, since part of it is desert for some reason.
Oh, is it?
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely very, very heavily fictionalized.
Yeah, but that gave us like a lot of the mechanical and thematic pieces of Teeth, because it's this place which has been cursed and it's been cordoned off, and you play as these profiteers and mercenaries who are dispatched to collect bounties, and again that sense of place is just so enormously powerful in that game. Like it's like so important about how you play the game, because this is densely wooded and wet place, and it's complicated to traverse even, and if you do it incautiously, you're tipping off other players about where you are and what your intent is. And so much of the game is about reading or listening to the landscape for signs. Like you're thinking, has someone been here? Was that a flock of startled birds in the sky to the east? And you hear splashing now, and then you're like, they must be in the bayou to our left. And we wanted to bring some of that kind of like that real engagement with the environment to Teeth.
Interesting.
Yeah.
If I can ask, where did the corruption track come from? Is that just wholly you guys, or did that come from a different game as an inspiration? Or because that was where my players really lit up, was how awful their characters could become. We wound up with one of my characters, my players was really pushing into the corruption track, and he wound up, what's the Welsh horse that comes out at Christmas?
Oh, it's I can't never remember how to pronounce it. The
I can't
or
pronounce
something
it
like
either.
that, is it? Yeah, I'm not sure, but I know the one you mean with the horse skull.
He wound up as a cryptid that looked quite a bit like that. He was ethereal and horse shaped and horribly elongated, and he absolutely loved it. So I have to give a shout out to our push through your modules with that, and we people just really embrace the grotesque in these games. So, where did this come from?
I can't remember. Can you remember that, Marsh? I think basically we had played with the idea in Stranger and Stranger. So we ended up... So for context, for people who haven't followed our journey, we wrote a lot of the book very quickly at the start of our collaboration, and then decided to sort of take a step back and to write some shorter like one-shots and explore what we were doing with some sort of zine-length publications, the third of which was Stranger and Stranger, which was some villagers off to the north.
That's what we played first.
The main setting. And it became clear very quickly that the mutating and changing and evolving would be incredibly entertaining for us to run. And Marsh writes a good mutation, I have to say.
Yes, he does. I had to content warning a couple of them because I was like, okay, I know I have one person who has some body issues. I'm going to let you pick what your mutation track is, because you had so many of them that was like, nope, can't do that, no.
Yeah, there was some grisly grotty bits in there, but I think there's a level of inventiveness, particularly from Marsh, in just how those might look and function, and I personally found it just enormously entertaining to start putting that together, and from Stranger and Stranger through to the main game, and I think there's definitely some stuff that we've picked up playing other games. Like again, Simba Room with the abomination in that, where your aura is slowly darkened as you spend more and more time in the forest, and it changes the kind of character that you are. I love that stuff. I can't get enough of it, and so I think it was very obvious to me and Marsh that kind of design needed to go in.
Yeah, we needed. I mean, we were searching around for a hook for Stranger and Stranger for a while, and we had. I think Stranger and Stranger was one of the first ideas that we penciled together. What would become Stranger and Stranger? I think originally it was called something like Pitchforks or something like that. We knew we wanted country bumpkins to go up against some great peril, but we hadn't quite worked out what that arc would look like. And when we did come up with the modules, we were sort of, I mean, we were growing not just the fiction of that world, but we were sort of trying to grow them mechanically and asking more commitment and engagement from the players with each release. So the first module we released, Night of the Hogman, is very silly, and it's very quick. It's very easy to get what the idea of it is. It's straightforward, it's simple. You're a bunch of travelers being beset by mutant pig creatures, which is not a complex motivation. And you just have to get from A to B and survive. You can play it in a single evening, and you can probably explain it as you go to people who've never done role-playing before. And then you've got Blood Cotillion, which is this slightly larger thing. It might take a session or two. It's in a single location, so it has a sort of containment to it. It's a single evening. It's a glamorous ball of the kind seen in Jane Austen fiction, but your exploration of it is totally nonlinear. You're there to expose and surreptitiously murder high society cultists, but you can achieve that in really any manner you choose within the constraints of it being a single environment and a single evening. And then with Stranger and Stranger, we knew we wanted to set up something with greater complexity and freedom again. And it's this open-ended mini campaign in which, the bumpkins go on a quest to save their village. But in order to kind of ensure there was some sort of arc to it, that's where the mutations came in, because it provides that tension with their narrative goal, which is that they could become so compromised by this cult contamination that they might meet a completely different fate, or simply not care at all about what happens to their village by the end of it.
Exactly.
And I think it also simply works from the sense that in the fiction, these characters are being exposed to this cult stuff for a much longer expanse of time than in the other modules. And that's one of the reasons that we felt it needed to be in the main Book of Teeth, because you have a year there to conduct your business, and it creates this time pressure where the players are mutating potentially, but they need to be able to get out of this cordoned off, quarantined place. And so they need to, disguise their mutations perhaps, or in order to blank their way past the soldiers, so they aren't then just locked in the veil forever.
Oh, it was we started off with Stranger and Stranger, and I ran that as a mini campaign. And some people who had never done Blades in the Dark before were therefore introduced to the mechanics of it, and they loved it. And they really embraced the mutations, as I said, and they were making use of them. Like, okay, we're going to, you've set up a fort where there are all these doppelgangers running around. We're going to just blip in, because I can turn with a little bitty stress into something that's insubstantial. I'm going to grab the artifact. I'm going to blip out again. And I was like, well, that trivialized that, but that was really fun. So we'll roll with it. So the part of the joy of role playing is that people can use things to overcome obstacles, and why not? We're going to shift gears here a little bit to my next question, which is actually a question that you guys asked me to pose. So TTRPGs are there to be played, but for a lot of people, the people who buy them, maybe even most people, they'll be read and never played because there's only so many hours in the day, and there's only so many games you can lure your players into playing with you. So when writing Teeth, you said that you weren't just servicing the needs of a potential GM, but trying to write a book that would be entertaining to consume as a reader of fiction. How did you manage to do that? Because I've as I said, I've been working on and off on something since the pandemic myself, and it's currently sitting in a slush pile at a press that has asked me to sign an NDA, so I can't talk about it. I can talk about my part about it, but I can't talk about what they might or might not be doing with it. Again, the intersection between fiction and making an entertaining story so that people can see that there is a story in the background, that there's a history, there's a depth to it. How do you make that mission work at the same time as the mission of this is a playable thing? This is an artifact that you can pick up, open up, and bam, a campaign comes out of it. And I'm going to start with Jim with that one.
I think initially we just wrote an enormous amount. The initial document was sprawling and filled with ideas and characters, and it's taken waves of iteration. And I think what we ended up doing would have been an enormously thick book if Marsh hadn't then edited all that down over several waves of doing so. But I think it was just general prolixity on both of our parts. We had to produce enormous amounts of stuff and then see that, because actually I was thinking about this as you were saying this earlier, Marsh. We actually did start with a fantasy setting, somewhat not unlike sort of Blades in the Dark's fantasy setting, and then quickly realised that it would be more interesting and funnier, I think, if it was the England of the 18th century. And then suddenly connecting that with real world characters, real world events. Anyone who follows our newsletter will probably be aware of the research section in the links, where we often post the sort of weird characters and strange historical figures and events that we've encountered. And there's such a richness of those throughout history, and so much of it is documented online, that we spent countless hours researching wolves that broke into churches and characters who were famed for being able to eat an extraordinary amount, and pirates and soldiers, and just this enormous kind of wealth of material from the real world, that because Teeth ended up being set in a version of the real world, there was less adaptation required than it would have been to fully fictionalize this stuff. We're able to take highwaymen and criminals and other characters and have them walk directly into the pages of the book. And I think that ended up. I mean, one of the interesting things for me, actually, having read a lot of other books and also people's commentary on this, which puzzled some people, especially people who were very, very familiar with RPG books, is that we put the world book stuff first in the book. Like a lot of RPGs, it'll be how to run the game, what this is, all the rules up front, and then you get into the sort of material at the back. I'm not saying we're the only book that do this, because there's a bunch of books that put the world book first. Yeah. But
Vampire the Masquerade is very much here's the lore dump first for 400 pages. Then we're going to tell you how to make your character.
And I like that personally. Like I think, but equally, these books are at their very best when that interlinks and that weaves together, and you can see how setting and rules support each other. And I hope we've done that with Teeth. But I think it had to. we had some very intense discussions, almost right up to the point where we ended up getting the thing printed over how specific phases and rules and stuff connected. And I think the reason that we were so engrossed in that and embedded in that was because we knew it had to be faithful to this world book that we'd spent so much time writing. It had to be a game that showcased the characters and, as Marsh said, finding ways for the landscape to speak, not just in a kind of here's a few lines of flavour that the GM can read, but in the way in which the actual systems play out. I think that had had an enormous effect on how we wrote it and why we wrote it in the way that we did.
Yeah, I think the idea that it has to be both a usable manual for role playing and also like this readable, entertaining fiction. I think those two needs mostly serve each other, or they can. I think there's sometimes a risk of like, as with maybe the criticism of Lancer, like over defining a bunch of stuff, which then doesn't feed into the actual act of role playing. But I don't know, by just accident or not, we ended up with this structure for the world book, which contains story sort of like threads, which the players then will find inviting and go on. So we break up the world into these locations, and then we have a number of specific narrative things that are happening in each, or can happen within in each, and the players can encounter, and those link up to events and people elsewhere. And part of the motivation for that is that you can be in this world, as a group of players, you have potentially different agendas. So you can start the game with a secret mission to birth some alien god, or you could be there to identify and bring to justice a particular person in the world. These are completely different motivations with a very different sort of potential arc to them, and each of them need to have opportunities to advance that cause that are written into the world. And so we did it so that some locations lean more towards one than another, that you're more likely to end up at a particular location if you have a particular motivation. And so just through like the simple avarice of the players, they will end up, if they come back to the setting to play a different agenda, they'll be drawn through a different selection of content, ideally.
Yeah.
But also, there should generally be more than one way to exploit a situation to satisfy these different agendas. So just having those different impetuses in place, it ended up provoking us to create something which was quite layered and sort of naturally deep. And I think, in the way that these different things connect, we end up telling quite a lot of sprawling stories in the book that are told in this dispersed way through inference or reference, and readers get to piece these together. You mentioned earlier like the page references, and that was a big discovery for us, that we might have a throwaway line about like the legendary sharpness of the black sword of Wirrigan or something stupid like that, and that term will be bolded with a note to turn to a different page in the margin, and then on that page you learn that Lord Narsley just recently lost a famous heirloom sword along with his arm in a swamp. And you can sort of connect these pieces, and I think and then on another page in the bestiary you discover that like the shank demon's hide can only be cut by a blade of supernatural sharpness, and the notes and the margin will say like this one perhaps, and link back to the black sword of Wirrigan, and suddenly you've connected player motivation to a mechanical requirement, to a story that exists in the world, and a possible location for the players to explore next. And as useful as that is for a group of players, I think it also satisfies like the reader's desire to unravel and put together a mystery in the same way that any kind of mystery novel works. There's a series of clues, and on your own kind of auspices, you can kind of piece them together. I think that's one of the reasons that it's, I hope, entertaining to read as well as to play, and that those two things don't fight each other as much as they can do.
I should add to that actually that one thing that has been really delightful and super validating of all the work that Marsh put into that is once people realize those connections are in there and they start following those links, they read the whole book. Now, I have to say that I'm a absolute habitual browser of books. Dip in and read a little bit here, a little bit there. Quite often read the playbooks first, no matter what page they're on. The character sheets or the the skill lists and things like that. And maybe I'll come to the lore later. But most of the people who have read Teeth have said to me, once I started reading the World Book, I just, I just read it all the way through, and that has made me just absolutely beam with joy because it completely validated all of that stuff, and seems to have really connected with people, which has just been brilliant.
That's wonderful. I'm going to say that the reason I came into Teeth is that I was subscribed to the Fallen London newsletter because I played Fallen London for a couple of years. And this game shares some of the same sensibilities with your work, dark humor, love of history, and historicity. Had either of you actually played Fallen London before getting going on this, or is it just a wonderful synchronicity that they happen to recommend it and I happen to fall into Teeth as a result?
Oh yes, we're big fans, aren't we?
Yeah. I played Fallen London back when it first turned up. I think how long ago that was now? Many moons ago.
What was it called originally? It was called something like Something Bizarre or something like that, wasn't it?
Yes,
the Echo Bazaar.
Echo Bazaar. Yeah,
that was it. Yeah, I mean, back when it was Echo Bazaar, I remember they did a talk at a games event in London, one of the sort of small indie events, and I went and listened to them talk there, and was very impressed with their approach to narrative and their approach to game design and so on. And I should say, for transparency, that I've actually become good friends with Chris Gardner, who's the narrative director at Fail Better, and he's currently running a Modiphius Conan the Barbarian campaign, in which I am a Hyperborean wizard, and he's an incredible GM, like really, really great. So that's been tremendous fun. And, in latter years have got a lot out of Sunless Seas and Sunless Sky and so on.
I'm looking forward to playing Mask of the Rose because I did Sunless Sea. I didn't do Sunless Skies, but Mask of the Rose just looks incredible, and I want to pick it up. It's just a question of hours in the day again.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. But their work is fantastic, and they have some of the best writers in the industry working on their material. So yes, well aware of it, and big fans.
Awesome. Okay, so let's see. What else do we have to ask about? We are going to talk a little bit about Kickstarting because you guys are currently, I know that Jim was talking to me before the broadcast about he's doing a Kickstarter even as we speak, which has funded. So we'll talk a little bit about that in your pending projects at the end of the broadcast. But right now, talk to me about kickstarting this game, because that was obviously a really big project and you couldn't know that it was going to get as big as it did. As I've told you before, I have my own game setting and system set up that's been languishing in that slush heap for an NDA that I literally can't talk about for over 200 days now, and they haven't responded back. So I'm looking at probably doing a Kickstarter at the end of the year. What do I need? What does somebody need to know before they get involved in something that's this big and this massive as a Kickstarter?
Marsh, would you like to spill those horrible beans?
The thing is, I don't think we are particularly experts at it. I mean, I don't know that Teeth's success was measureless beyond measure. It was.
Well, I think it was. You guys have an entire campaign setting book in addition to your another 200 pages that you've put out just on top of everything. Just as, oh, by the way, we have more.
well, we certainly fulfilled the promises. I think that's the thing that I would talk about to somebody doing a Kickstarter, is that in the first instance of this, it helped that we had pretty much entirely written, illustrated, and laid out the book by the time it came to launch. We just needed to know how many copies to print and to do some final editing, and I needed to learn about spot gloss covers. But otherwise, we were pretty much there. And I don't think that's important in the sense that I don't think backers care overly, and like there's plenty of Kickstarters that do well on a mere promise of something. Often, I think a very dubious promise, but from the perspective of our own security and our confidence on being able to deliver something that we'd promised when we'd never done anything exactly like this before, that was really important, I think, to our sanity. But I think now that we've done it once, we'll have the confidence to do it differently next time and fund at least some of the production up front. Although even then we'll have pretty much extensively tested the rule set first. So there's less risk inherent in that. But yeah, that's what I'd say.
I think my thing would be communication is the really hard bit. There is so much noise to the signal you're trying to put out in everything now, and RPGs are on the ascent, and everyone is starting to pay attention, and there's more noise than ever. The newsletter that we set up and ran, I think it'd been running for at least a year, maybe 2, by the time we went live with the Kickstarter. That helped hugely because people were paying attention, people were reading that, they're interested in what we had to say. They did the little notification thing before, when you get that coming soon page on Kickstarter, those people, those few hundred that follow us on the newsletter, and are the people that are most interested in the work that we're doing. Those people did that little thing on there, and that means that those people get an email from Kickstarter that reminds them to back and stuff like that, and that all of that helps the sort of compound effect of making the Kickstarter work, making it successful. And I think that stuff has been, it was a lot of extra groundwork, and it took time, but it was definitely worth doing.
Yeah, it's harder to know how to approach that now with some of the decline of social media in terms of Twitter falling off a cliff and so forth.
Yeah.
Definitely. Being able to communicate with the people who are the likely audience for your book is definitely the biggest challenge.
Yeah. A lot of what I do as a writer seems to just go into a howling void. I mean, I'm just amazed when an editor reads it and accepts it, and I'm like, oh, somebody else actually read it after the editor accepted it? That's a bonus. And I recently had the wonderful experience of a college professor reaching out to me and saying, hey, can I use one of your stories in my class? I was like, yes, absolutely you can. Would you like to write some answers to some questions my students have? I'm like, yes. You mean that people are actually going to read what I've written? Yes, I will by all means tell you all about my writing process. I can't imagine that they're going to be all that interested, but yes. But yeah, finding your audience is incredibly difficult, and hearing back from them is almost impossible. I came up doing a lot of fan fiction, at least one large fan fiction for Mass Effect. And that's when I had an enormous amount of fan response because I was hooked into a world that people had already invested in. And so I got like 25,000 emails as a result of it. So that's a lot. But I haven't had anything like that in the professional writing. So it was very validating to do the fanfic, but at the same time, it's like, if I could just tap into some of you people who said that you'd read anything that I wrote, I've written all these other things. Look what gems and worlds I have for you.
Yeah, it's difficult to know how to foster that community, isn't it? It's hard.
It really is, and I don't do a newsletter or anything like that because I feel like I'm enough social anxiety to feel like I'm imposing on people, and I know that when I get various newsletters coming in, it's like, is there anything interesting? No, delete. So I do read yours. Yours is always interesting.
Well, I mean, lots of people don't, and we can see the stats on it and stuff, and I kind of don't mind that, and I think perhaps I'm hardened to that from years of work on magazines and websites and stuff where you churn stuff out and then you look at the stats and nobody read that, but it's part of the bigger picture of somebody will read something, right? Like and if you're not producing that, and people you're not kind of it sounds incredibly kind of brutal and kind of thankless, but you've got to just keep going. It is this kind of it is this kind of like treadmill task of building and getting more people to notice and read, and it is work. It really is work.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think I was incredibly lucky. Like I was I was asked to do the talk a few years ago, and I felt a bit like it would be unfair for me to say, oh, do what I did, because partly because the the sort of ladder opportunities aren't really there anymore with magazines and so on. But also because I'm just aware that I was just incredibly privileged to come out of university, be unemployed for a year, and then go straight into this full-time writing job, which was really hard, because it was right. You just have to go and produce a magazine, and you're not even going to earn enough to live on, so you'll also have to do freelance. So my baptism into that stuff, that initial kind of initiation was, you just got to write all day and keep going and don't stop. And I think that does that hardens you a bit to it and makes you kind of ready to produce stuff, even if it does fly out into a void. You can never know when anyone ever read it.
I do recall,
you just keep going.
In the days of magazines, when we first started, the magazines got very panicked by the internet, and suddenly we had to cross-post everything on our website, and and then promote it on Facebook. I remember going onto Facebook and looking at the comments underneath this long article that I'd written, and people on Facebook just replied with a single word describing the first noun they could identify in the picture at the top of the article. So it'd be like just lots of people saying dog, 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 dog. And I was, you look at that and you think, what are we doing here?
Yes.
All these words spent on nothing. But you get used to that.
All right. So what's coming up next for the two of you? I know that we talked a little bit about how you have a new Kickstarter coming out, Jim. So let's talk about that first, and then we'll move on to what's coming up next for both of you.
Well, today, in fact, yes, it went live a couple of hours ago, which is the Mile Ships narrative art book with concept artist Ian McHugh. So Ian McHugh is a veteran concept artist, worked at Rockstar on the Grand Theft Auto games for years. Since then has been doing concept art for Hollywood movies and doing book covers and so on. And through all his work, he's had this sort of personal thread of floating, flying machinery, ships and boats, and all very inspired by going to dockyards. And he's from Sunderland. I think his dad worked in the shipyards, and he loves all the kind of the flavour of that, the machinery, tugboats, the bigger boats, the dockside cranes, all that kind of stuff has all gone into and sort of merged with his love of Scotland and the Highlands. And it's become this beautiful, rich, artistic vein of these flying boats and flying machineries and this archipelago of floating stones. That he's been painting for, I think, 13 or 14 years now, something like that. And way back, we said, we should absolutely kickstart a book of this. And it's taken us 7 years to get to the point where it's actually happened. So today is the day. And so it's really Ian's book. It's a book of his paintings. But what he wanted to do was to provide all those paintings with a sort of thread, a fiction, a narrative. And it isn't a book of a story, and it's not really. It's not sort of a world book in the RPG sense, but it is a book that is sort of scrapbook of that world, a narrative scrapbook. So it has lots of things that are written as if they are objects and items from that world. So the logbooks of the ship's captains and pages out of history books that have been written in that world, and people's reports, and a cartographer's maps and his sketches of things that he's found in the world, and his notes and journals and diaries and police reports and scraps out of newspapers, and all of that builds together to provide a sort of caption and framework for all these fantastic paintings. And that's going to be a great big lavish hardback book, which will turn up next year and is kickstarting right now. Kickstarter.
For transparency, we are recording this on the 3rd of April, but I will expect this episode to go live before the Kickstarter is done. So please send me a link to the Kickstarter so I can go ahead and put that in the comments, and people will be able to hopefully get in on that.
Absolutely will.
And Marsh, what's coming up soon for you?
It's all teeth stuff. It's all teeth stuff. It's mostly moving house stuff immediately for me. But after the near life-ending threat of stress and destruction abates, then we'll be back with lots of teeth stuff. We have free-to-play, pay what you want, module coming out for a sort of rule set for high seas adventure called Reaver, which can be plugged into existing role-playing sets to facilitate adventure on the waves as pirates or navies or what have you. We're currently in the stages of getting that up on its feet for some proper rigorous playtesting, which we'll probably do through our Discord as well as privately. And we have a number of other projects on the go as well. I don't know if we can talk about them yet. Maybe not. But there's an exciting one which is set in the Teeth universe, but in a slightly different time period, which has been interesting for us, as it's probably our most ahistorical venture yet. Can I talk a little bit about it, Jim?
Yeah, go for it.
We decided to set something in the 12th century. Which is a time of amazing upheaval in Britain, and for that reason, it's really exciting to do something there. But as we were writing it, we like to kind of impart the fictions that we write with a flavor of the time period. So there's a sort of kind of slight stuffiness to the way that we write in Teeth, like the language of it that's meant to be evocative of like the Austen and Smollett era of language, a slightly kind of overly kind of structured and elaborate way of speaking. And we want to sort of imbue everything we do with a sense of that time period. But I found it very difficult with the 12th century because all of the things that we think about as medieval...
You don't speak Norman French, for start.
Well, exactly. Yes. And well, even worse than that is that we don't speak Old English. We don't speak Old Norse. And like even the things that you think about as being medieval, like jesters and so forth, they're all things that appear in the 13th and 14th century after the Norman invasion has properly kind of wiped out,
settled out.
It's strange because I was thinking, okay, I'll drop a kind of a word in here that's true to the time period, and actually none of them are recognizable to modern audiences. So I can't just put like a thorn or a yog or one of these other glyphs that no longer exactly. And I was looking for like a contemporary word for a jester, and there isn't one. It's glee man is the closest thing I could come up with. But I mean, if you talk about glee men casually in a TTRPG, nobody's going to know what you're talking about. So in the end, it's ended up being this sort of high Middle Ages mishmash of stuff, but nominally set in the 12th century, which is really annoying to me in a way. But it's still good fun, I think. So with that's coming up to a second bout of playtesting now, and then we'll put that out to the Discord as well at some point.
Ooh,
and in the
I
long
look
term,
forward to this.
Yes, well, it's also our most mean-spirited thing yet. So you may want to warn your group of role players that they have to brace themselves for some amount of intergroup fractiousness potentially.
Oh, we have that anyways.
Okay. But then long term. Sorry, Jim.
You're on mute, Jim.
I was going to say there is some backstabbing involved, but not literal backstabbing, but but certainly sort of narrative and conceptual backstabbing.
Yes,
Nifty.
And then later in the year we're going to kickstart our second book in the Teeth universe, which will be a piratical fiction set in the year of 1782, but in a fictionalized version of the Antilles. So we'll be using the rule set that we've tested in Reaver to provide the naval rules for that. But then it will be appended with presumably a large amount of pirate nonsense from us.
So on the subject of Reaver, can I, since you said it was sort of agnostic, can I use this rule set to, say, go after Leviathan hunters in Blades in the Dark?
Yes, I would think so, yeah. So
Nice.
The idea of it is that it sort of bifurcates your roles as people from the roles on the ship, so that when you are a sea, you have a whole different set of character sheets, essentially, that represent different aspects of the ship's operation. So it should plant quite neatly into, especially like Forged in the Dark based games.
Yeah, I mean, it is still a Forged in the Dark kind of playbook driven system, but one that I think represents the fact that ships, and especially sailing ships, are complex systems with lots of people plugged into it.
Yes, they are. They really are.
That's the thing that Marsh is trying to really kind of deliver a tonal and systemic piece for, and it's pretty exciting. I think to have it's going to allow us to have more chunky phases of doing very different things within the game, which I'm quite excited.
When I was on a tall ship not too long ago, maybe 6 years ago, I was just overcome by the sense that each ship operation system was the people were part of a machine, and the machine and each piece of the machine was part of the ship, and the ship itself was a machine, and the people themselves were therefore plugged into it. And I told this to my husband, who used to be in the Coast Guard, and he was like, "Well, yeah, duh," because he actually sailed on a tall ship, which is the Coast Guard cutter Bark Eagle. And I'm like, and I was like, well, I'm sorry that this realization came to me late, but
well, he's going to be very annoyed by all the things that break the laws of physics in our game. Yeah, I was looking up the viability of club hauling the other day, which is when you throw an anchor out in order to effect a sharper turn, which occurs in Pirates of the Caribbean at some speed, but in reality has fewer and more specific uses. But I think explaining
you have to make
them
sure that you are that you can actually reach bottom at that point in time too would be helpful.
Yes, and you can't be going at any great speed, otherwise it'll just rip the anchor out of the ship.
Yeah.
But although interestingly, in this research, I discovered, I don't know if you recall the scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where the crew run from side to side on the ship and eventually capsize it. That's actually physically possible, apparently. One of the stupidest scenes in the movies could actually be achieved, but club hauling could not. So there you go.
All right. That is the end of my questions. Thank you both for having been on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Next week on Shining Moon, we are going to continue on game writing with the author of Cerberus the Crystal City, which is a little RPG that I love. That will be Zach Wellhouse and Amelia Gorman. As always, if there's a like and subscribe button to hit, please do hit it, because that does help feed the algorithm. And we are all subjects of the algorithm these days. And that is all we have. We are out.